So it's a great joy to welcome Dr. Fred Travis firstly to speak about this new book and what it presents, and then I think he will introduce Dr. Harung. Welcome to you both, and please go ahead, Dr. Fred Travis from MUM.
Thank you, Peter. It's a joy to be speaking on the friendly chat. So Harold and I had many conversations. I've been looking at brain changes as we grow towards higher states. He's been, in terms of brain functioning, he's been looking at performance, top performance in individuals. And we realize that we should be working together to tie brain integration, what's happening inside the individual, with our outer performance, what's happening outside. It's been a very satisfying collaboration, and this book is one of the crowning achievements of our thoughts together. Let's try the first slide. This should say Unified Theory of Performance. This is the wholeness of the book. And what it's bringing out is performance. Peak performance is due to inner factors and outer factors. Four basic factors. The inner factor is mind-brain development, which has three components to it. The outer factor is the quality of the collective consciousness. When we looked at mind-brain development, we realized there's three levels. There's a level of brain functioning that supports your state of consciousness, and those two together support how you think and act, your psychological development. And we see that in this chart, the two bottom boxes, which are linked together with double arrows, are brain integration and experiences of higher states. Those are both the same function, and just looking at it, two sides of the same coin. As brain integration increases, so the experience of higher states increases. And these together support the development of psychological function. And all of these three together are what are important for peak performance from the inside. Let me just show this in terms of the brain. This would be the next slide. This would be a brain, and the title up top should be Transcending Reduces Content to Experience Their Consciousness. In this chart, we see blue lines coming in from outside, that's content. That goes to the center of the brain, and the center of the brain talks to the surface of the brain, the cortex, and it's that ringing, that looping you see, which is a neural representation of what is outside. But at the same time, alertness circuits, wakefulness circuits come up the spinal cord, they go to the center of the brain, they also radiate out to the cortex, and this maintains our level of inner wakefulness, inner alertness. Now in waking, both of these are completely intertwined. And during waking, we typically are only aware of the content because that's changing. What's happening with TM is we're decreasing content. The mantra is becoming less. What is remaining are these wakefulness circuits. What is remaining is that state of alertness, which is always there, but has been covered up by ongoing experience. And the value of taking the brain to the state of just pure wakefulness is the state becomes self-sustaining. Let's see this in another way. The next slide, which reads increased blood flow to the prefrontal cortex during TM. This brain is looking to the left. We see the front part of the brain. The red color indicates increased blood flow. This is the front part of the brain. It's attention, executive control, impulse control, planning, decision making. During TM, we see increased blood flow to that part of the brain. This is the attentional center. This is the alertness aspect of that experience. Blue means decreased blood flow, and we see that's in the brain stem itself. This is a part of the brain that governs just bodily functions, breath rate, heart rate, arousal. Decreased blood flow here is what supports our decreased activation or increased rest in body and mind during transcending, in the transcendent. So what we have here is an interesting state. It's restful and alertness at the same time. And this is how Maharishi has described pure consciousness as restful alertness. And the reason this is important is what happens during meditation is seen outside of meditation. Next slide. This is of a person looking at a flower. And what this is showing is every experience we have is two things: attention going out and the perception coming in. So as we're adding the experience of pure consciousness, what we're adding is a more stable sense of self. And this is the critical factor for growth of mind-brain development. We can work on the level of mind and improve memory mnemonics, time planning, problem-solving skills. But that's just using the mind in different ways. It's not fundamentally changing how the mind works. By transcending, by adding the experience of restful alertness, what we're doing is fundamentally changing how the mind thinks, how you perceive. And this is seen in the next slide. This was the result of a content analysis of our athletes. On the upper right it says, mental game gives the edge. We interviewed these subjects about describe a time in competition when you performed at your best. Describe a time in competition when you performed at your worst. And we went into what was happening then. And what we find here is there was two levels of codes. So just to step back, we took their descriptions, which was a phrase, reduced the phrase to a single word, which is a code, and then we grouped these codes together. So we see there's two outer-oriented codes. The top-level athletes talked about outer training, about mastering achievements. This is on the outside. But most of what they brought up to describe how and why they performed at their best were inner codes. Mental preparation, self-reliance, inner training, wholeness, inner performance, and growth orientation. These 6 inner codes, they're talking about, they're giving expression to this added inner state of restful alertness. There's now a new basis for all thinking and action. And this will be the last slide I bring out, and I'll turn it to my dear colleague. This is the 8th slide. It's experiences of higher states of consciousness. We asked the individuals what were their frequency of experiences of higher states. We wanted to relate their subjective experience with brain functioning, with psychological tests. And what we see here is the managers that we measured. The top-level managers had significantly more experiences of all of the 3 higher states of consciousness. That's transcendental consciousness and witnessing and waking and sleeping. They also had more instances of luck. Indeed, what they said is it was their luck, which we know as supportive nature, which allowed them to be successful. It was their, as if ace in the hole. It's what they could rely on when all of the factors, the economic factors, were changing so quickly they intellectually could not grasp them. They could rely on this inner intuition. And this is a very clear expression of restful alertness, this deep inner silence of the mind being more available. So, Dr. Harung, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. So if you look at the next slide, number 9, that is a typical sample of what we call Performeasure, a measure of your performance capacity, where we have plotted the brain integration scale score, the peak experience score, and the moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is what we use to measure psychological development. There could have been many other measures that we could have used, like general intelligence or creativity, but we choose moral reasoning because we think it's a very important measure in today's complex and fast-changing world. So this is, and then we can go to the next slide, where we have put all our research together. It's the Performeasure assessment for athletes, managers, and musicians. And there are 6 columns on this chart. The 3 dark columns are the world-class performers, the performers on a very high level. And the light columns are the average control subjects. And what you see on this chart is that there is a highly significant difference between the world-class performers and the average performers in all three categories. And even though there are only 20 to 30 subjects in each of these word groups, we get a very high significance, which indicates that there is a strong difference between the high performers and the average performers on this composite measure. And it's also interesting to note that it seems that the musicians as a whole are scoring higher than the managers, which again are scoring higher than the athletes. And this indicates that music is also a good strategy for developing the brain and for mind-brain development. Then there is a fourth dimension. We can go now to the next slide. So far in this presentation, we only been talking about the individual dimension of a high performance, and we think this is by far the most important. But the context where the performance takes place, the organization and the society where the performer is operating also have an influence. But we find that even in troubled economical societies, there are some people that are successful. So it seems to us that it is the individual factor or the individual level of mind-brain development which is by far the most important. But society and organization have a level of mind-brain development which will impact the individual performance. And what we have on the next slide, where we have stages of organization and societal performance, that's the title of the slide. Then we have a model in the book of 4 stages of collective development. And the first is what we call a task-based. And what is most important there is what you are doing. And so the concentration focus is on isolated tasks. There is a command and control. The bosses are really very bossy, and it's fear-based with little joy. Many organizations, by the way, are still at this stage today, but many are also moving into stage 2, the process-based, where the main concern is how you are doing it. You are integrating the isolated tasks into a process. There is more teamwork here, for instance, less fear, more joy. And then when we move into stage 3, value-based, where what is most important is why you are doing something. In other words, what is most important is meaning and purpose. And these are beautiful organizations. There are a few around. We hope there are going to be many more. We talk about several in the book. And this is an organization where you find a lot of joy, a lot of creativity, and people are stimulated to think for themselves, to have their own opinion on matters. And the most interesting stage of collective development, of course, is number 4, consciousness-based, where the wholeness is the main concern, the wholeness on the move. And it's like a collective peak experience or a collective higher consciousness in the group of people. And we give several examples in the book of such highly inspiring organizations, 2 sports teams and 1 orchestra. And we also talk about research from the Max Planck University in Germany, showing that when people play together in music, there is a brain coherence or synchrony in the brain between the different persons. So this is bringing brain integration up to a new level, highly interesting. So if we move to the next slide, number 12, its title is Collective Consciousness Governs Collective Performance. We are in our circles used to talk about collective consciousness being the governor of organizations and society. This is a very fascinating idea that goes back to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And what we have done in the book, we have cited many examples from research supporting the idea that collective consciousness is the governor of collective performance. For instance, there is a study in the USA showing that more self-aware associates gives better financial business performance. So when the associates are more reflective, they have less blind spots, as it's called, then the performance of the whole organization is on a higher level. A blind spot is if you think you have a strong point and your associate thinks that the same point is the weakness. It means that you are not really in touch with yourself. And what we found is that in more advanced, more high-performing organizations, there were less people with blind spots. Also, what is interesting, research on Wall Street shows that if there is a kind of collective or common assumption, and if somebody challenging that assumption, then there is a significant increase in the fear center of the brain of those people who are challenging. So this also illustrates the power of collective consciousness. And what we have also found in research in Norway and USA and the United Kingdom is that if you are replacing the manager in a soccer team, and this is what they always do when the team is not performing well, but it's an illusion because research shows that it leads only to negligible performance improvement, and of course it's very costly. And another thing that we all know is that home wins are much more common than away wins in sports. And this is also because of the collective consciousness, because the home team have supporters that have emerged. There are many more of them, so they have a much more stronger collective consciousness than the visiting team's supporters. And therefore, it's much more common. In about 3/4 of the games, the home wins are much more common than the away wins. And then we can look at the final chart, the next chart, where we have the front of our book. And we put forward the idea, the central idea of the book, we call it the unified theory of performance, is that the level of mind-brain development is the active ingredient, the by far most important factor in determining a person's level of performance. But there are many illusions in this field, and therefore we have in one of the chapters in the book, we are looking at research, looking at possible alternative explanations of high performance. And we do find that they can't explain high performance. And let me go through it quickly. First, number of years of education. Well, there are studies involving millions of people and thousands of research projects put together in a meta-analysis showing that the number of years of education only explains about 1% of your performance level. That means hardly anything. Of course, education is very important. We are not saying that. Education is necessary if you want to be a dentist or a doctor or an engineer. You have to have higher education, but it doesn't seem to increase your general level of performance. And once you've grown up, work experience only explains 3% of your performance level. And age in adults, 0%. So this is quite interesting and I would say alarming news here. And the reason why education and work experience and age doesn't increase performance in adults is that mind-brain development normally freezes or stops around the age of 20. A little bit goes on to about age 25, but on the whole, it stops between 17 and 20 years. And therefore, from our theories, since mind-brain development is fundamental, if mind-brain development stops at around the age of 20, then it follows that so should also performance freeze. It shouldn't increase after that age. And this is what research is finding. And then there is another factor that people might think improve performance, and that is practice. Practice makes perfect, is said. And that is true to some extent. On the average, research shows that amount of practice explains 12%. It explains most, about 20% in repetitive activities like sports and music. And in professional work, like a computer programmer, it only explains 1%. And then the last thing I want to touch briefly is money, because there are many incentives, financial incentives, especially in sports and in business. But frankly, it doesn't seem to work, research suggests. It works for simple manual work like painting a wall, but in terms of quality of performance, there are actually no studies, and many have been made. There are no studies showing long-term improvement in quality of performance based on financial incentives. So then we go to slide 14, where we're going to sum up what we have said today. Point one, mind-brain development is the foundational factor in determining level of performance. It's the active ingredient in level of performance. Two, TM leads to the experience of restful alertness that Fred talked about, and that restful alertness provides a stable ground for peak performance. In other words, TM is the most effective technique for developing precisely the qualities that we find in world-class performers as compared to average performers. So this underlines again the beauty of Mauritius' technique, transcendental meditation, in developing a basis for high performance, and even more important perhaps, a basis for stable inner happiness or bliss in life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Harung. This has been fascinating, and thank you very much to Dr. Fred Travis as well. Now, this that you have just been, the previous slide, not the last slide, the penultimate slide, it showed how just education accounts for 1% of the effect of one's performance ability, and something else, very low percentages. But now you have put the theory forward, a unified theory of performance, that says that the level of mind-brain development is the key. Now, do you have a percentage or a list of research which you give in the book that to back that up, to illustrate that?
This slide we show the big difference between the high performers and the average performers, which is backing up, and also there is actually, since we published the book, there is a major study that came out of Oxford University, a group of scientists led by a professor of Oxford University, which is very much supporting our theory, because what they are looking at, something called brain connectivity. It means that different centers of the brain, how much they are connecting physically with each other, how much they are communicating. And what they found is that people who had, and they studied 460 people and they measured activity in 200 centers in the brain, so it's a huge, and they had 200 tests on behavior and psychology of those people taking part. And they found that those people who were scoring high on brain connectivity also scored high on like memory, happiness in life. And those who scored low on brain connectivity, they had problems with drinking and smoking and not being happy in life and ill health and things. So this is it's a huge study that supports our idea that we put forward in the book.
Beautiful, thank you. And another question, if we could go back to the Performeasure assessment. You had three axes or 3 points that you are taking into consideration: the brain integration, moral reasoning, and what was the third?
It's a frequency of peak experiences.
Frequency of peak experiences.
Yeah.
And what is a peak experience?
Well, I mean, peak experience was introduced by Abraham Maslow in the West, and it is. I've studied his writings very closely, and it is a glimpse of transcendence or transcendental consciousness. It's a glimpse of higher consciousness. It could actually be a glimpse of any of the four higher states of consciousness that Maharishi has been talking about, and what is so beautiful, because these people have never studied, that we studied, they've been doing TM or they haven't studied Vedic psychology or anything. They were just talking very innocently. We asked them, please describe how you feel in mind and body when you perform at your very best. And then out came these beautiful experiences of higher states of consciousness. Like I have on here a soccer player saying, a world-class soccer player saying, I always am where the ball falls down, the right place at the right time. So that's the part of nature. And then we have, and also I give many, whenever I give a lecture to students like at the university where I work, I ask them about this question that I just asked. And the invincibility is one of the words that comes out most frequently, the sense of feeling or sense of invincibility. And here I have Thomas Alsgaard, the cross-country skier who won 11 gold medals in World Championship or Olympic Games. He was described as the joy runner. He was always in for the bliss. And here he's saying, when everything is at the very highest level, then I feel invincible. The uphills are not long enough, nor steep enough. Extremely good sensation. So he wanted the hills to be longer and steeper because he was feeling so full of energy and so full of effortless action. And what a point I would like to make in this context is because we found that 84% of all the people we talked to, including the controls, have had at least one peak experience of transcendence in their life. And I think almost everybody has such experiences. And this means that in the context of TM, I think we should be more bold talking about higher consciousness, because I'm sure people can relate to it. And everybody, if they ever had one peak experiences, would like to have many, many, many more such experiences. Yeah. So I think it's a very good angle to take to talk about peak experiences, because it's really the most joyful and fulfilling moments a person can have in life.
Often when one learns to meditate, it's a peak experience.
It is. Yeah. And you see, that's another point, because all these athletes and world-class managers and musicians we talk to, they wanted to have more peak experiences, but they don't know how to create it, because it just comes by accident. One day they suddenly have it, and the next day they don't. And so we can whisper in the air that, well, there is a technique, TM, for systematically developing the frequency and intensity of such experiences.